is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. The Quad group of countries launches an Indo-Pacific maritime surveillance initiative as China grows more assertive across the region, while also stepping up cooperation on critical minerals and energy security. Now, China urges all sides to uphold a ceasefire after U.S. strikes in southern Iran and Tehran shot down a drone. Hopes for a final peace deal remain, but an agreement could still take days. Now, Seoul boosting its underwater deterrence to counter North Korea's threats with plans for its first nuclear-powered submarine by the mid-2030s. This as South Korea's military detects fresh missile launches by the north, with several projectiles, including a ballistic missile, landing into the Yellow Sea. And Philippine President Marcos heads to Japan for a 4-day state visit, where he will meet Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, and talks are expected to focus on boosting defense ties and energy security.
Thank you. It's an honor to have this precious award once again after everybody done their...
Also tonight, a triumphant return for BTS on the world stage. The K-pop superstars winning Artist of the Year at the American Music Awards for the second time. And an elderly Japanese security guard finds unlikely fame, armed with nothing but duct tape, patience, and a steady hand. Quad foreign ministers have reaffirmed their stance on maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific and announced a series of pacts on energy security and critical minerals. Now, the bloc also released joint statements of concern over recent maritime activities. They condemn attacks on commercial shipping and oppose future measures that do not align with UN Treaty on Maritime Movement. Now, they also raised concerns over the militarization of disputed features in the South China Sea. China's foreign ministry says it does not support exclusive camps in response to the group's announcement.
关于四边机制，中方已经多次阐明立场。我们始终认为，国与国之间的合作应当有利于促进地区的和平、稳定和繁荣，不应当针对第三方。我们也不支持搞排他的小圈子，不支持搞阵营对抗。任何合作都不应当损害地区国家之间的互信和合作。
We've got Neha Punia for CNA joining us live from New Delhi. Neha, first help us break down all the new initiatives announced after the Quad foreign ministers meeting today.
I tell you, this group was meeting under tremendous scrutiny, that meeting taking place just down the road from where I am right now in the heart of New Delhi. And what we saw was the foreign ministers of the Quad grouping have expressed tremendous optimism about the potential of the group, also trying to put up a united front. Marco Rubio calling this a group that is aimed at ensuring, action-oriented deliverables and practical cooperation. And to that effect, they've announced a host of pacts. The first one, most significant, being a joint infrastructure project, the first of its kind by the bloc to build a port in Fiji. Now, the Quad minister saying this is in response to insufficient port capacity in the Pacific Islands. They've also, like you said previously, announced a critical minerals initiative. It's a framework, they say, that will help build resilient supply chains in a transparent manner for emerging technologies. They've also announced, this is important, an energy security pact. We don't have too many details, but Marco Rubio is saying that this is going to help build energy resilience in the region, and that the US is going to host a meeting to this effect towards the end of the year. And this is important because we've seen what the impact of the Iran war has been in South and Southeast Asia. Countries here paying an outsized price for the ongoing, oil crisis because of a bulk of those oil and gas supplies coming through the Strait of Hormuz to this region, and the U.S. indicating it wants to work with Quad nations to try and address some of those energy security issues. They've also talked about accelerating collaboration to conduct more maritime surveillance in the region, and of course, something that underpins the group is the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and there were lots of references to that with Quad foreign ministers saying they're going to continue to work together to try and ensure they uphold that principle.
So quite a number of announcements made. Neha, does this meeting then mark the revival of the Quad, perhaps as a counterbalance to China's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the signal, certainly, that the foreign ministers were trying to convey, according to experts. Because remember, before this meeting happened, the last meeting had only happened in July 2025. And there were many questions about the relevance of the group, given the sort of focus the US has had on the war in Iran and also on resetting ties with Beijing. We've seen how, for the US in the last 2 years, we've heard them talk about China more as an economic rival and not as a strategic one. And that's led to questions about what it is that this group can then work together to do to try and counterbalance China's growing assertiveness in the region. But Marco Rubio, using his visit to New Delhi to continuously counter that, saying that this is still a relevant group. The Quad, he says, is a cornerstone for America's foreign policy in the region, and it is an important group of like-minded strategic allies, he said. But, there's still questions, Otelli, about what happens next, because the much talked about, much delayed Leaders Summit has still not happened. Marco Rubio saying it could happen towards the end of the year, but New Delhi would like President Trump to travel to New Delhi so the summit can be held here before it can pass on the chairmanship to Australia. But we still don't know if that's on the cards. But Quad foreign ministers certainly indicating that they will continue to who's relevant to the region.
All right, many thanks for that report. Neha Punia for CNA in New Delhi. A fragile ceasefire under growing strain. Iranian forces say they downed an American drone after the U.S. military struck targets in southern Iran. The U.S. Central Command called the strikes defensive actions and that it will continue to act with restraint during the ongoing ceasefire. The Revolutionary Guard says that it reserves the right to retaliate against any violation by the U.S. China has again urged all sides to observe the truce.
我们敦促相关方履行停火承诺，坚持以和平方式化解争端，继续通过对话谈判达成兼顾各方合理关切的解决方案，推动尽早恢复中东海湾地区的和平。
Now, uncertainty also surrounds efforts to reach a deal. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that an agreement could take days. Iranian negotiators have met with Qatar's prime minister to lay the groundwork for future talks.
در این مرحله ما به هیچ عنوان راجع به جزئیات موضوع هسته‌ای صحبت نخواهیم کرد. این یادداشت تفاهم 14 بندی متمرکز هست بر خاتمه جنگ. اگر این اتفاق بیفته در یک بازه زمانی 60 روزه راجع به موضوعات مرتبط با هسته‌ای گفتگو خواهد شد.
Well, for more, we've got Blake Sifton for CNA joining us live from Tel Aviv. Blake, so these latest strikes by the U.S., to what extent will it threaten the ceasefire?
Good evening. Now, we've seen an exchange of fire between the United States and Iran in recent weeks in the Strait of Hormuz in limited skirmishes. But these attacks by the United States really do come at a very precarious moment, of course, with Iranian negotiators in Qatar. And an extension of the ceasefire, a deal to reach an extension, really did seem imminent over the last few days. Now, U.S. Central Command has seemed to downplay these attacks, saying they're showing restraint, calling them self-defense to protect our troops from threats posed by Iranian forces. Of course, they say they struck Iranian boats that were laying mines as well as missile sites. Now, for their part, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard say that they have the legitimate and definite right to respond to what they call violations of the ceasefire by American forces. They say they destroyed an American Reaper drone, as well as fired on an American jet that crossed into Iranian airspace. So these kind of attacks and counterattacks really do show the potential for the situation to degenerate and potentially spiral out of control. Now, today we've also heard from Iran's supreme leader. In a statement on Telegram, he said that Gulf countries would no longer be a shield for U.S. bases. And of course, he has not been seen in public since the initial airstrikes of this war that killed his father. And there are reports that he communicates with his deputies through a complex network of couriers, and that is delaying messages to those deputies, to other Iranian leaders, and is delaying the potential for a deal between the United States and Iran.
And Blake, on top of that, we have intensifying Israeli attacks in Lebanon, and how is that going to affect prospects of a deal?
Well, that's right. Just the last little while, the Israeli military came out and said that they struck over 100 Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon, as well as the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon. That comes after Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a statement that he had ordered the Israeli military to intensify blows against Hezbollah. And there are reports in Israeli media that an emergency call-up of reserve soldiers has begun as part of a potentially wider military operation in Lebanon. Now, all of that follows what has really been a seismic strategic shift on the ground in Lebanon in recent weeks, where Israeli forces are positioned some 10 kilometers deep into Lebanon. Hezbollah is increasingly using the kind of small first-person view suicide drones that have become ubiquitous in the war in Ukraine and really transformed the battlefield there. They are using those against Israeli forces and against Israeli vehicles. They are connected to a thin fiber optic cable, which means they cannot be jammed. And Israeli forces have essentially had no response to them. They are now conducting most of their military operations at night and remaining indoors for fear of really the menace of these drones. And calls by the Israeli public for a greater response in Lebanon have been mounting. Throughout what's been a very shaky ceasefire, the Israeli military has seldomly struck Beirut. Under pressure from the United States, they have mostly concentrated their daily airstrikes on southern Lebanon, but there are now fears that they may expand those further into the east of Lebanon as well as into Beirut. There are reports that people are now leaving the southern suburb of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah stronghold, and Iran has said very clearly that they want an end to Iranian-Israeli attacks in Lebanon as part of a wider deal with the United States. So an expansion of these Israeli attacks could potentially jeopardize those talks between the United States and Iran.
And many thanks for that update, Blake Sifton for CNA in Tel Aviv. Now, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Taiwan's TSMC is powering more than just the AI chip boom. It's now lifting TAIEX up the global rankings, helping it overtake India by market capitalization. Plus, a Samsung Electronics Union representing workers outside the ultra-profitable semiconductor division asks the court to block vote on pay deal. Details in a short while. Hello again, you're watching East Asia Tonight, and I've got Olivia Marzuki joining us for the very latest in business. So Liv, oil markets, they're apparently reacting to the latest US strikes in Iran. Tell us, what are investors watching for?
Well, they're watching two things, I'll tell you. So first, whether the fighting will disrupt oil supply, and second, whether US and Iran can keep peace talks alive. Oil prices are moving mixed following US military operations in southern Iran. Brent is moving up again at $98 a barrel, nearly $99 a barrel, and WTI easing slightly to 92.60 cents. Investors weighing on Washington's mixed messaging on the peace negotiations with Tehran. And Japan's Nikkei share average fell today, retreating from a record high in the previous session as investors locked in their profits and rising oil prices weighed on sentiment. The Nikkei ended marginally down, and the broader topics just a touch underwater. Now, South Korea's Kospi back from the long weekend, hitting a new all-time high, past the 8,000 level. Boosting sentiment was hopes that Washington and Tehran may be nearing a peace deal. The won strengthened against the greenback, and strong gains there for chip-making giants. They soared to record levels before paring some of those gains, ending the day firmer by 2.2% for Samsung and 5.7%, nearly 6% higher for SK Hynix. Well, Chinese stocks ending the day flat after a correction in tech shares. Investors are also jittery around Beijing's crackdown on illegal cross-border trading. Shanghai there ending the day 0.17% down, and Shenzhen a little bit above water. Hang Seng also closed slightly in the red, but excitement towards chip making boosted semiconductor stocks in Hong Kong following news of Huawei's potential tech breakthrough. Chip makers SMIC and Hua Hong bucking the wider weakness. They climb more than 16% at one point before paring some of those gains. They still ended firmly in the positive territory. Huawei announced yesterday that it will start making 1.4 nanometer chips with its own logic folding technology within 5 years. The process could help China narrow the gap with TSMC and boost the development of Chinese AI models. But experts say the technology remains unproven and will depend on the success of Huawei's Kirin mobile chip launching later this year, the first products to use the process. Taiwan's TSMC boosting the island's stock market up the global rankings, overtaking India by market capitalization. TAIEX is now ranked 5th globally at $4.95 trillion US dollars, edging past India at $4.92 trillion. The jump comes just over a month after the benchmark overtook the UK and Canada. Both Taiwan and South Korea are riding the AI boom, with tech heavyweight stocks surging. Taiwan's ascent is largely driven by TSMC, which now accounts for more than 42% of the benchmark index. The chipmaker shares have rallied 49% so far in the year. Analysts say that Taiwan's stock market still has room to grow after regulators raised limits on how much domestic funds can invest in a single stock. That's a move that JP Morgan Chase says could bring in more than $6 billion in inflows. Experts say that the surge in Taiwan's market value alongside India's decline highlights two key forces shaping markets in 2026. First, soaring oil prices from the Iran war are hurting growth prospects for energy importing economies like India. Second, optimism over AI is fueling global rally in tech stocks, benefiting manufacturing hubs such as Taiwan and South Korea. China's electronic and electric vehicle export machine continued its aggressive global expansion as shipments rose 40% on year last month. Brazil was the top importing nation. Shipments of Chinese EVs to Brazil rose 220% in April. Thailand and the Philippines also among top 5 export destinations. Shipments to Indonesia dropped 10%. Regionally, Asia received the largest share of Chinese EVs, with exports 20% up on year. Europe ranked second with 36% more shipments. Notably, exports to markets in the EU rose 41%. And domestically in China, EV registrations in April rose 2.8% on month. And this means that fully electric vehicles accounted for nearly 42% of all newly registered vehicles in April versus 38% in March. Registrations of hybrid vehicles increased to 13% of all new registrations. Experts say consumer demand has shifted in favor of EVs as oil prices remain elevated. Ferrari's bet on going electric failing to win approval from investors and buyers, with its shares sinking today after it unveiled its first ever fully electric model. Ferrari CEO has hailed the launch of the Luce as new chapter for the 86-year-old Italian sports car maker. The company says the choice of name, which means light in Italian, is meant to evoke clarity and direction. But the light at the end of the tunnel for Ferrari could still be far, with shares of the Milan-based automaker down more than a quarter over the past year. Rival European marques such as Lamborghinis and Porsche have also scaled back EV plans, citing weak demand. South Korea is keeping a closer watch on overseas private debt investments at a time when regulators around the world are scrutinizing the trillion-dollar industry. The financial watchdog says private credit holdings by Korean pension and state-run retirement funds rose to about $17 billion by the end of February. That is 55% higher than around $10.8 billion in 2023. The regulator says the bulk of the exposure is to debt in the U.S. and Europe. State-run funds also said to have a more concentrated risk, with about a fifth of their exposure tied to the tech sector. Private debt refers to lending outside public bond markets and traditional bank loans. Companies may use it because fundings can be faster, more flexible, and easier to customize. The announcement comes as global regulators monitor the potential risks in the $3.5 trillion private credit market. Wealthy investors have lined up to withdraw money from some private credit funds amid concerns that AI could potentially disrupt parts of the industry. A Samsung Electronics Workers Union representing the Consumer Electronics Division says it has asked a court to block a vote on a pay deal that mainly benefits employees in the company's chip unit. The agreement, reached last week, primarily benefits workers in its highly profitable semiconductor business. Some are estimated to receive about $416,000 in bonuses this year, while those outside the chip unit could get about $4,000. The Samsung Electronics Co-Union took up legal action after being told it had no right to join the ballot. It had left the negotiating team before the tentative wage deal was settled due to concerns that chip-making divisions are being disproportionately favored. It is among Samsung's smaller unions, with about 13,000 members. A separate association representing about 20,000 chip and non-chip workers has also said it was upset with the terms of the deal and will vote against it. The ballot by unionized workers began on Friday and is due to conclude on Wednesday. The co-founder of one of the world's leading AI companies have called for stronger oversight into the rapidly expanding sector. Anthropic's Chris Olah said that artificial intelligence governance cannot be left solely to tech companies. Mr. Olah spoke at the presentation of the Pope's first encyclical, which called for regulation on AI. The Anthropic official echoed the calls, saying that stronger external oversight of the sector is needed because companies like his face commercial, geopolitical, and personal pressures that do not always align with society's broader interests. A Financial Times report found that the tools can strip safety measures from Meta and Google models in minutes. Once modified, these models reportedly answered unsafe prompts involving malware, biological weapons, and child exploitations, raising fresh concerns for AI companies and regulators. That's pretty much all I have in business for now, Oteli. Back to you.
Thanks so very much for that, Olivia. Well, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next, the Philippine president heads to Tokyo on a state visit with a focus on economic and defense deals. As Quad countries, including Japan, launch initiatives on energy security and critical minerals, we'll be speaking with a Japanese expert after the break to help us unpack this all. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The Quad launches a new Indo-Pacific maritime surveillance initiative amid China's growing assertiveness in the region, or deepening cooperation between members on critical minerals and energy security. China urging all parties to uphold a ceasefire after Iran says it shot down an American drone, and Washington carried out what it calls defensive strikes in southern Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says an agreement on ending the war could take days. And South Korea says it is looking to launch its first nuclear-powered submarine by the mid-2030s under a new program aimed at countering North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. President Lee Jae-myung says that the program will build on the basis of the nation's strong alliance with the U.S., while the defense minister says the submarines will be developed and constructed in South Korea. Now, the announcement comes as North Korea launched several projectiles off its western coast, including at least one short-range ballistic missile. The South Korean military says the projectiles flew about 80 kilometers before landing in the Yellow Sea. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has declared the country's nuclear status irreversible. Now, to help us break down what South Korea's defense ambitions mean for the peninsula and its allies, well, my colleague Grace Shin, she joins me now in the studio. So, Grace, help us understand what exactly is South Korea trying to build here, and how is it different from the submarines that it has now?
Well, South Korea already has a capable submarine fleet, but its current submarines are conventionally powered, meaning that they're not powered by a nuclear reactor. So while they can be quiet and they can carry missiles, they have limits. At some point, they need to recharge the batteries or take in air, which means that they have to come close to the surface, meaning that it's very easy to detect. Now, what Seoul wants to build is a nuclear-powered submarine, which does not mean a nuclear-armed submarine. Now, a nuclear-powered submarine refers to how exactly a submarine can move. It uses a small nuclear reactor to provide energy for propulsion, whereas a nuclear-armed one means that the submarine carries nuclear weapons. So South Korea says it's not trying to do that. The military advantage of having a nuclear reactor to provide energy is endurance. It will allow the submarine to stay deep underwater for much longer, and it can also travel farther and much faster. So for South Korea, this is about having a much longer-lasting presence under the sea. And as you mentioned before, with North Korea's growing missile threats, especially with North Korea trying to develop submarine-launched missiles, Pyongyang can launch missiles from underwater, and South Korea just wants to be able to find and follow and respond in advance. And that's why authorities are referring to developing an underwater kill chain, seeing and being able to detect North Korean submarines early enough before any damage is made. And as you mentioned, South Korea wants to develop this by the mid-2030s.
So, I mean, whenever you mention nuclear, that tends to raise eyebrows. But as you've mentioned, these submarines, they are not nuclear armed. So why is non-proliferation still an issue?
It's because nuclear, I think it does raise a lot of eyebrows here, because the sensitive part is not only about whether the weapon itself is nuclear or not, it's whether the fuel and technology used to power a submarine is. And South Korea, as you mentioned, is drawing a very clear line here. It's saying that it will not possess nuclear weapons, as it is rightfully to do so as a party of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But a nuclear-powered submarine still requires nuclear fuel. Seoul says that it will use low-enriched uranium and work closely with the U.S. while obliging to the non-proliferation obligations. And if we take a history lesson real quick, it was in the 1970s with concerns that Seoul may pursue its own nuclear weapons program during the Cold War, but South Korea had committed to not to ever acquire nuclear weapons and place its nuclear activities under international safeguards. But the gray area for many other countries that are all part of the NPT is naval nuclear propulsion, because while the non-proliferation system was designed to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, it never really specified or dealt with every neat detail for nuclear propulsion. But even if submarine is not carrying nuclear weapons, South Korea still has to prove and is willing to prove that the nuclear fuel won't be diverted for any weaponry purposes. That's why Seoul is talking about working with the IAEA very closely, and it's sending the message consistently that this is more about propulsion, not proliferation. But the burden now is whether Seoul can actually convince the U.S. and the IAEA and other governments that this program will be transparent and tightly controlled.
So elaborate a little bit more on that. Curious to know, how does this fit into South Korea's relationship with the U.S.?
This is where the story becomes more of a submarine story and more of a geopolitics story, because South Korea definitely has strong capabilities to build its own ships and civilian nuclear industries. But given that nuclear submarine propulsion is one of the most sensitive technologies in the world, it also needs to work closely with the U.S. The South Korean government says it has secured American support for nuclear-powered submarines during last year's summit, the APEC summit in the sidelines in Gyeongju. But that's best seen by many experts as a political green light, not a finished deal. So many details need to be outlined. For instance, who supplies the nuclear fuel, what technology can be shared, and how will the fuel be monitored? Where will the submarines actually be built? And the last point could become quite contentious given that the U.S. and South Korea have a strong ROK-U.S. alliance. South Korea has been depending heavily on the U.S. since the Korean War. They're under the American nuclear umbrella. But President Lee has also been calling for a faster transfer of wartime operational control from Washington to Seoul. And the reason why where everything will be built is a contentious issue is because President Trump has been pointing to the Philadelphia shipyard acquired by Hanwha Ocean as a possible construction site. But South Korea's defense ministry mentioned today that the submarine should be built with technologies native to South Korea and built in South Korea. So many details there as to how far the extension of the U.S. military presence in South Korea will go remains an issue. So taken together, the message right now is that Seoul wants more military autonomy, but still within the U.S. alliance. It's not trying to break away from Washington per se, and it still relies on Washington, but it still wants its own autonomy. So the broader significance is South Korea's nuclear-powered submarine will be a test of how far it can strengthen its own deterrent while staying within the U.S. alliance and the global non-proliferation system.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Grace, for explaining that to us. I was just talking to Grace Shin there on the implications of Seoul's nuclear submarine program on the Korean Peninsula. Now, the flagship of South Korea's submarine fleet has docked in Canada's British Columbia, where it is serving as a floating floor model in Seoul's pitch for Ottawa to buy a dozen like it. The crew of the ROKS Dosan An Chung-ho arrived in Canada on Saturday, following a voyage that lasted nearly 2 months and covering nearly 15,000 kilometers. Well, that journey also sets a record for the South Korean submarine force by completing the first ever crossing of the Pacific. Now, the vessel was officially welcomed at the Canadian Forces base Esquimalt yesterday. Well, its arrival comes ahead of exercises with Canadian and other partner forces. Hanwha Ocean, which built the submarine, is one of the 2 bidders for the multi-billion-dollar contract to supply Canada's new submarine fleet. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. begins a 4-day state visit to Japan today, as both countries mark the 70th anniversary of a normalization of ties. Now, Mr. Marcos is set to meet Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, and they will be discussing the country's strengthened strategic partnership, including maritime security, food security, and efforts to manage oil price shocks that's linked to the Middle East conflict. The Philippines says that it will push for deeper operational cooperation with Japan, including information sharing, defense coordination, equipment transfers, and support for modernizing its armed forces. Now, both sides are also expected to announce new agreements on defense, trade, investment, and human resources. Well, quite a flurry of diplomacy is unfolding across Asia, and to help us unpack the region's security climate, I'm going to bring in Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor at the Fujitsu Future Study Center and also former Special Advisor to the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Thanks, Dr. Taniguchi, for joining us yet again. Let's just kick things off with the big picture question here. Now, quite a few things happening. When you put together President Marcos's visit to Japan, we've got that Quad meeting in Delhi and also the run-up to Shangri-La Dialogue, which is happening here in Singapore. So, Dr. Taniguchi, what sort of a bigger strategic picture is emerging about where Asia is heading exactly?
It is not a substantial departure, but a logical step ahead of what these countries have made already. For instance, Australia has chosen to buy a cutting-edge destroyer from Japan. For Japan, this is going to be the very first attempt to sell weapons of that nature to other countries. So Australia, Japan are bound by strong security cooperation. Now, the Philippines and Japan have chosen to become quasi-alliance partner in addition to Australia and Japan. And India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, original Quad member countries, are reinvigorating, in my view, their strategic value. There has been zigging and zagging, trying to see the direction clearly for Quad member countries. But now with the threat from China more apparent, and with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, making a wake-up call to all these countries' leaders, I think they're coming back to their strategic foundation. That's what's occurring all at the same time.
So I want to pick up more on the Quad because its agenda seems to be widening, right? I mean, the Quad is now moving into maritime surveillance. They're talking about critical minerals and energy security. But for Japan specifically, how do these initiatives fit into Tokyo's wider Indo-Pacific strategy?
Quad was originated by the late Prime Minister Abe. He published an article called Asia's Democratic Security Diamond. If you connect 4 dots of Hawaii, Tokyo, Darwin, Australia, perhaps Perth, Australia, and India, you can have a diamond-shaped picture. And that's a Quad. And in that diamond-shaped picture, you get seas of East China Sea, South China Sea, and parts of the Indian Ocean. So it's a pledge for these 4 maritime-oriented democratic nations to work always together to safeguard the free and open nature and the rules-based order of the Indo-Pacific. So that being a strategic foundational concept, as I say, those 4 leaders are coming back to where Quad began.
And now to Marcos's visit to Tokyo. I mean, it's sort of framed around diplomacy and partnership, but I mean, Japan is seeing Philippines more in terms of its regional strategy. So I'm trying to understand this because Japan just last month allowed lethal weapons exports, and given that its regional security role is also growing, what sort of defense cooperation do you think could emerge from Marcos's visit to Tokyo?
The first thing that I should say it's long overdue. Not only President Marcos, but his predecessor, President Duterte, has repeatedly urged the Japanese side to change Japan's peaceful constitution at once and do much more on Japan's defense, beefing up of Japan's defense. But President Duterte was staunchly anti-America. Now, President Marcos is more strategically minded, if I may say, in cherishing the relationship with Japan and with the United States, aware that these 3 nations combined could give a strong deterrence capacity for the Philippines vis-a-vis China. Now, for Japan, it's all about Taiwan because Taiwan is neatly sandwiched, if you look at the map, between the Philippines and Japan, 2 of the staunchest allies of the United States and democratically mature nations. So if the Philippines has chosen to become more like an alliance partner to Japan, it's going to be very much a welcoming sort of development for Japan.
So just to push that point further, so if the Philippines becomes one of the first recipients of Japan's lethal defense hardware, what message would Tokyo then be sending to the rest of ASEAN?
I'm not sure if the Philippines is going to be the first because the plan is going on between Australia and Japan, and Australia is planning to buy the cutting-edge frigate from Japan. And you've just covered what South Korea is doing vis-a-vis Canada, showcasing South Korea's defense and shipbuilding capacity, eyeing the opportunity for Canada to procure South Korea-made weapons. So South Korea is much more advanced as a weapons producer and weapons exporter. So what Japan is going to do is just a baby step forward. Nonetheless, because Japan has done nothing of that nature, it's a very significant step forward.
So for Southeast Asia, I mean, Japan is often seen as, being less polarizing of a security partner than, say, China or the US. But I mean, how far can Japan go as the region's preferred hedge without ruffling China's feathers, even more?
Well, it's a fine balance to be struck all the time. In China, you've got Japan's companies have got tremendous amount of economic stakes. no Japanese leader, Sanai Takaichi included, cannot ignore the accumulated amount of stakes that Japanese businesses have had. And when it comes to ASEAN, you must always highly appreciate the unity and centrality of the ASEAN nations. So it's not in the interest of the Japanese to appear as if the Japanese are looking down upon anyone else. Rather, the Philippines and Japan could set a precedent and a sort of a model for other nations to follow, because everyone in the ASEAN nation is fearful of the behemoth in their neighbor, namely China. But the Philippines and Japan can stand firm and tall by cooperating with each other. That's going to be giving a very good lesson to follow for other ASEAN nations as well.
So in a nutshell, if you could just recap this all for us, what is that major breakthrough that you would be looking out for Marcos's visit in the days to come, since he'll be there for 4 days?
One of the significant symbolic events will be to sign the GSOMIA agreement, which is to jointly share highly sensitive military intelligence. And if you have that sort of agreement between two nations, you're now looking at an alliance taking shape between the Philippines and Japan. That's one. And more symbolic, President Marcos is going to give the highest civilian orders both to the emperor and empress. So that also is going to cement the already good relationship between the two nations.
All right, we'll certainly be looking out for those. Thanks very much, Dr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor, Fujitsu Future Studies Center, and former Special Advisor to the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Well, we're going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, an elderly Japanese security guard is winning fans one strip of tape at a time, turning ordinary signs into works of art. A Starbucks in South Korea has seen a sharp drop in sales after backlash from a marketing campaign. The promotional event, dubbed Tank Day, referenced a military crackdown on pro-democracy protesters back in 1980, and reactions included criticism by President Lee Jae-myung. The chairman of Shinsegae Group, which owns a controlling stake in Starbucks Korea, made a public apology at a press conference today. He also appealed to the public not to take out their anger on Starbucks Korea employees and frontline workers.
어떠한 변명도 하지 않겠습니다. 이번 일에 대한 모든 책임은 저에게 있습니다. 제 잘못입니다. 저를 포함한 신세계 그룹 구성원 모두 우리 사회의 역사와 희생을 기억하고 늘 국민의 마음을 깊이 이해하고 존중하겠습니다.
An internal investigation did not point to any intentional wrongdoing, but it did expose, quote, serious flaws in its risk management framework. Shinsegae fired the head of Starbucks Korea last week after apologizing over the campaign. Well, Starbucks global headquarters in the U.S. said it is aware of the gravity of the situation. A backlash from the marketing blunder is also spreading to the entertainment industry. Some celebrities are facing criticism after being spotted holding Starbucks beverages. Videos have also been posted of individuals smashing Starbucks branded mugs. Well, meantime, K-pop making one of its strongest showings yet, the American Music Awards, taking home 11 awards across categories. And in a comeback like no other, global stars BTS scores a triple crown, including the coveted Artist of the Year honor, beating out competitors such as Bad Bunny, Taylor Swift, and Sabrina Carpenter.
Our biggest thanks and gratitude, as always, goes to the armies all over the world.
The leader RM referring to the nickname for BTS fans. The band first won the honor back in 2021 as the first Asian act to do so. became the only Asian act to win it twice. The Korean septet, who recently returned to the world stage after military service, also claimed Best Male K-pop Artist and Song of the Summer for the single Swim. The Song of the Year went to Golden, the upbeat tune from Netflix animated movie K-pop Demon Hunters, beating strong contenders including Alex Warren's Ordinary, as well as Taylor Swift's The Fate of Ophelia. Now, the trio behind Golden EJ, Audrey Nuna and Ray Ami won Best Vocal Performance. The film itself nabbed the Best Soundtrack. Well, Cat's Eye, meanwhile, emerged as the new Artist of the Year, alongside wins for Best Music Video for their song Gnarly, as well as Breakthrough Pop Artist. They are a global girl group with members from 4 countries. Now, an elderly Japanese security guard is finding unexpected fame making signs, not with a printer or a paintbrush or even a design software, but with something far more humble, the ubiquitous duct tape.
One of Japan's most in-demand graphic designers is neither hip nor an artist by training. He's a 72-year-old security guard at a train station in Tokyo, making signage out of duct tape. Shuetsu Sato said it all started when he was asked in 2004 to help travelers navigate the sprawling Shinjuku station.
新宿駅の工事で、地下通路を拡幅する際の案内係を誰かやらないかと言われて、私がやりますと名乗りを上げました。当時迷路のような通路になったものですから、これは言葉で案内するよりもガムテープで、案内板を作った方がお客さんにしてみれば分かりやすいのかなと思って作り始めたのがきっかけです。
Soon, Sato was getting requests from all over Japan, for movie posters to work for corporate giants. One of his latest projects is collaborating on a logo for Nike's new store in Shinjuku Shopping District.
驚きと、びっくりですね。で、今でこそその駅を離れて依頼されることが多いんですね。CD のタイトルとか本のタイトルだとか。
Last year, Sato even won the Japan Sign Design Association's Platinum Award for his unique typography, now known as Shuetsu Tai after his name. But for all his popularity, the septuagenarian has never charged a set fee, leaving compensation up to his clients. One time, a station master thanked him with a pair of new socks. Sato merely asks for meals and transportation costs, and the understanding that he will use only duct tape.
別にその賞状をもらうためとかじゃなくて、とにかく誰でもいいんです。喜んでくれる人がいればいいんですよね、それで。だからもう自分が楽しいことと一人でも見てニコッと笑ってくれればそれで僕はもう満足なんですね。
I hope you've enjoyed Tuesday's edition of East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia, and you can find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.